Hello, comrades, and welcome back to Ushanka Show. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи. В эфире программа Ushanka Show. Stories from the USSR. My name is Sergei Nikolaevich Sputnikov, and back in 1971 I was born in the Soviet Union. Меня зовут Сергей Спутников, я родился в Советском Союзе. So today we're going to talk about Jewish people in the Soviet Union, and I know this topic is quite let's put it challenging. I was putting it off for quite a long time, but we need to just plow through it, talk about it, and see what happens. But before we begin, I would like to thank all my Patreon supporters for your help. Thank you so much. It really helps to concentrate on the topics, not on trends, not at what gets the most views and likes and clicks. So thank you so much. Your help is greatly appreciated. I mean, YouTube itself is an amazing tool. It made it possible for a regular person to share stories with the whole world, but their analytics sometimes are so annoying because they constantly push you to make videos that get the most amount of clicks, the most amount of views, most amount of likes. If I would listen to YouTube, I'll be just making everything, all my stories about Chernobyl and Soviet food. And I also have a public announcement before we begin. If you are sensitive on the topic of Jewish people, anti-Semitic topics, you probably don't want to watch this video. I already got a couple of guys commenting on my video about Bold and Bankrupt when I said a joke about Jewish people always answering with question to the question that called me anti-Semitic. There'll be more jokes in this video. It was the part of the culture and we have to talk about it. So if you can handle it, please don't watch this video. If you follow my channel, you should know by now that I'm a, how would you say it in English, odd duck. By my nationality, I'm an Ukrainian, but I'm a Soviet Ukrainian, which means I grew up speaking Russian. Russian was always my first language, Ukrainian second. Now my, I don't know, Russian and English probably like together, and Ukrainian will be my third language. And also, I'm 2% Jewish. When I checked my DNA with Ancestry.com, and I always considered myself Soviet. You know, it's kind of interesting. Out of all Slavic people, at least in the Soviet Union, so we're talking Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, Ukrainians were considered the most Jewish-like people. We had a lot of jokes about similarities, and one of my, I don't say favorite, but it's when the first Ukrainian was born, the Jewish person sat down and started crying. But before we get rolling, let's have a quick lesson of Russian language. Урок русского языка. Еврей. Еврей. So еврей is a Jewish male person. Еврей. Еврейка. Еврейка. So that's a Jewish female. Еврейка. There is also offensive noun for Jews. It's Žid. Žid. And it's similar to what in English they say
Cake. Cake.
So Žid is an offensive noun for male Jewish person, but I believe in Polish language it's how they call Jews. Židy, that's the normal word. In Ukrainian, old Ukrainian language had Žid as a Jewish person, but later they got Yevrei, and then offensively they'll call somebody Žid. And then Židovka. Židovka, there'll be a female Jewish person, and it's also kind of an offensive noun, Židovka. And it's kind of interesting. When I was talking to my father a couple of weeks ago, questioning him about the events of the World War II, when my grandmother, his mother, was hiding a Jewish lady when Germans came to their village. My dad, that's in his language he used, he said, yeah, my mother was hiding that Židovachka. So there was kind of like a nicer way of putting, he didn't say Židovka, Židovachka. So that's a little bit nicer. It's like I call vodka Vodachka. So that's a nicer way. So Židovachka instead of Židovka. But my dad used that term in our recent conversation. And despite the fact that in Soviet Union we talked all the time about all the nations are equal, we still had a lot of anti-Semitism going on domestic level, like in everyday life of Soviet people, as well as on a state level. Which is kind of strange because many of the Russian revolutionaries were Jewish people, list is long, and that's one of the topics for conversation that was actually like a Jewish plot to destroy Mother Russia. I remember reading somewhere that even Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin, which is totally Russian name, had a Jewish grandmother. Then of course there is a Leon Bronstein Trotsky, a son of the wealthy Ukrainian Jewish farmer Lev Borisovich Kamenev, whose actual last name was Rosenfeld, and the guy who made a bad bet and joined forces with Comrade Stalin against power struggle with Trotsky, and later he was thanked by being shot in 1936 for being a member of Trotsky Zinoviev Center. And of course we need to mention Grigory Zinoviev, original name Gershon Aronovich Radomelsky, born 1883 in a wealthy Jewish farmer family, once again in Ukraine. He was a huge supporter of Lenin. In fact, he was the second Bolshevik after Lenin. And once again, he made a bad decision. He played a role in promoting Stalin and got shot in 1936 in Lubyanka prison. What I find the most interesting fact about Grigory Zinoviev is that he was hiding together with Lenin in the little tent, so-called shalash, on the lake Razliv. So that's one of the famous Soviet Jesus Lenin stories were taught in schools and kindergartens. Lenin had to run away from St. Petersburg when temporary government, Временное правительство, declared Bolshevik party illegal, so they had to run away from St. Petersburg and hide. So Zinoviev was hiding with Lenin together, but he was never mentioned. I was always under impression that Lenin was there by himself. Sorry for this little detour. So back to the topic of the Jewish people in Soviet Union. If we talk about being Еврей in the Soviet Union, we need to talk about Soviet passport. By the way, I already have a couple of videos on the topic of the Soviet documents, two of them called Most Important Documents in the Soviet Union. You're welcome to check those out. You'll learn a lot about documents and all the papers that we had to carry or own back in the Soviet days. Our Soviet passport was the internal documents. We had a different passport for traveling to other countries. This was a passport for inside, and it had a lot of useful information for the authorities, like your propiska. If you remember, I talked about it. Everyone had to be assigned to a specific address, and it was called propiska. Also, after getting married, Soviet boys and girls would get an ink stamp in their passports indicating that they got married in such date in such town, and that was actually a very effective tool for the girls. If they like the guy and the guy really wants to move forward, but she's not sure if he's single or married, she could just ask, hey, can I see your passport? It happened quite often. And then if you're a married guy that's just trying to goof around, you'll get busted because your passport didn't lie. The Soviet passports also had so-called пятая графа, the fifth column or the fifth line. That's where your nationality will be written down. So in my passport, unfortunately I can't locate it. I know I have it somewhere. It said Ukrainian. While if you are a Jewish person in the Soviet Union, your fifth column, your пятая графа will say Еврей, Jewish. So if your fifth column says Еврей, it means that you couldn't get some jobs or you couldn't get to a specific college, and there'll be this kind of lingo going on like, hey, what about this guy? He looked like a decent worker and then now he has a problem with his fifth column. У него проблемы с пятой графой. Some Jewish people were so desperate that they attempted to change their nationality record, so change their fifth column. Usually it could be done through marriage. So if you marry a Russian, you can change your nationality to Russian, or you probably could do it through the bribes or find some distant relative way back, like, hey, he was Russian, so I would like to change my nationality to Russian. But of course, if you look like a Jewish person, it doesn't matter if your fifth column says that you're Russian, and we actually had a joke about that. So one Jewish guy calls another and yells like, hey, we need to run. There's a bunch of drunken Russian workers marching down the street, and they beat everyone who is Jewish. And his friend answers, oh, I don't care. My passport says I'm Russian. And his buddy answers, right, but they don't punch the passports, they punch the faces. So let's talk about how could you recognize that a person is Jewish or not. First of all, of course, facial features, like a lot of Jewish people, they have a dark hair, mostly it will be wavy. They may have a little bit oversized pointy nose. I mean, I'm talking some stereotypes, but it's also truth. Of course, dark, big eyes, maybe large forehead. So just by the face, you usually could recognize a Jewish person quite easy. So let's take a look at my kindergarten photo, which was taken sometimes around 1977. And let's see how many Jewish children or adults can you recognize. And what's funny about this picture, I never knew as a kid who were Jewish children in our group. And I also didn't realize how pretty was our music teacher, that the blonde chick in the middle, in the background. And only when I saw that photo a couple of years ago, I was cleaning my archives and I looked and it jumped at me, first of all, how pretty my music teacher was, and also how many Jewish children I had in group, and I never paid attention. And you can pause this video and study the photo, and then we will discuss and compare our results. So this is what I got, and I don't know for sure if they were Jewish, but I'm just guessing based on the picture. So this older lady next to my hot music teacher, she definitely looks Jewish. On the far left, kid standing, that boy looks Jewish. I think he was Jewish. And the girl in this interesting dress right next to him definitely 100% was Jewish. A short, serious kid right next to the girl in that dress also looks Jewish to me. And these two looks like twin girls, one on the far left, one on the far right, definitely Jewish girls. But I just want to mention that we played just fine. I never had anything like, oh, don't play with these kids or play with these kids. Back in the kindergarten, we all were playing outside, had no national problems or any issues. Okay, товарищи, so this concludes part 1, Life of the Jewish People in the Soviet Union. I hope you enjoyed this video, learned something new, and we'll talk to you soon. В эфире программа Ushanka Show. My name is Sergey. I'm 98% Ukrainian, 2% Jewish, who was born back in 1971 in Soviet Ukraine. Today's video is part 2 of my story about Jewish people living in the Soviet Union. And I want to thank everyone for your interesting comments, suggestions, and likes for that video. But as I expected, YouTube instantly demonetized that video. Topic is kind of sensitive, and YouTube doesn't like sensitive topics. So if you like my stories, you can always support my work by purchasing my book, American Diaries 1995. It's available in Russian language and English language, and American Diaries 1996. I'm working on translation, so it's only available currently only in Russian. And once again, a friendly reminder, if you're very sensitive about topic of Jews, anti-Semitism, you probably don't want to watch this video. You can't ford the river and keep your pants dry, so please don't watch it if you have problems with those topics. So today I want to tell you my personal experience growing up in quite anti-Semitic environment. And to begin my story, we need to go to my favorite place on earth, a small village, Zhoved, in northern Ukraine. As I mentioned many times before, I spent there every summer pretty much from 1972 all the way to early 1990s. And I was a favorite grandson of my grandpa Sergey. He took me fishing, I helped him to cut and chop firewood. I helped him to make moonshine. But in the evening, I enjoyed listening to his stories about war with Germany. By the way, I already made a separate video about my grandfather's experience during the World War II, or actually during the Великая Отечественная война, the Great Patriotic War, Soviet Union against Germany. So you can check it out. But of course, today we're not talking about World War II, we're talking about Jewish people in Soviet Union. But one time my grandpa began his story with this really odd statement, and I was probably pretty small, 5 or 6, because what he said I understood in completely different meaning. I didn't know there's such a concept as like idioms, right? It's like something, you say one thing but you mean different thing. But that really kind of struck me, that's why I probably still remember. He said something like this. Перед войной евреи, he maybe said жиды, I don't remember that part, already had, wow, I just jumped from Russian to English. Okay, I'll try it again. Перед войной евреи уже всех нас засунули в мешок, и им только оставалось завязать веревку. Но тут пришел Гитлер и спас нас. So to translate it to English, before the war, Jews already had us in a bag. All is left is to tie the rope around the neck of the bag, but here came Hitler and he took care of them. And this is how I know that I was little, because I was shocked. I was actually picturing this humongous giant bag that people sit inside of this bag. So that's what really struck me, and I just remember that story forever. And that was quite an unusual statement for a person who spent most of the war as a prisoner of war in Germany, and he wasn't treated well. I told that story. He actually was tortured in Gestapo in Germany, but at the same time, he was talking almost with respect to Hitler for coming to Russia, to Ukraine, and taking care of the Jewish people. Really, really weird. And the only explanation I can come up with is that my family on my mother's side, they're well-to-do peasants before revolution. And a well-to-do is not like they call kulak. Later they come up with a term called podkulachniki, so not as rich as kulaks, but they had a couple of horses. They were renting probably some land. And then they lost everything during the collectivization, so probably there were some Jewish commissars or something like that. So from there on, my grandfather had this hatred for Jews. But of course, I was too small to ask any additional questions. I was still shocked thinking about this giant bag that Jewish leaders of the Soviet Union placed all the population inside. So that was my first introduction to anti-Semitism back when I was a tiny kid, having a good time with my grandfather and listening to his stories about the World War II. Several years later, I had a kind of interesting interaction with a Jewish engineer. He worked with my mom, and he really liked me. Now I'm looking back and thinking he probably really liked my mom, and at the same time, he thought I was a very smart, cute kid. So every time I would show up in my mom's work, I went there to get lunch in Stolovaya, in their cafeteria. He would talk to me and give me little presents. And one time my mom brought from work this big, actually I found it by the door at our apartment. He brought some mechanical device from something. It had a lot of spinning parts, like a lot of bearings. You could play with it for hours. I don't know what part it was, part of some machinery. I spent hours just messing around with it, tinkering with it. It was just a present from him because he liked me so much, so that was very nice. Now we need to jump in my story about, 5-6 years forward. So about when I was 14, in the 7th or 8th grade, they started sending us to the collective farms to help up in the fall. And I talked about that interesting situation when they had a severe shortage of seasonal workers in the collective farms and советские фермы, совхозы. So the solution was to pretty much force pupils, students from colleges, even from schools, as young as 4th grade, 5th grade to go in the fall and harvest by hand beets, carrots, and so on. So this is what was going on in our school in the fall. Teacher said, okay, guys, this Sunday, come to school at 8 a.m. There'll be a bus and we will take you to the fields and we'll be picking some crops. And by the way, we never get paid for it, so that was a totally free labor, which is another interesting detail. I mean, in some parts we had communism, you work for free. And usually most of us didn't mind. I mean, there was something different to do. I believe once in a while, maybe it'll be during the school week, so like Wednesday or Thursday, so we skip classes. Kids hated school so much, we would like rather be in the fields picking tomatoes or cucumbers. But to think about it, how effective could be kids in harvesting crops? We had zero experience, but I guess the reason, since we were free labor, it compensated our inefficiency. And by the way, everyone was required to go. We wasn't like volunteering. The only exception if you had medical reasons. And one girl in our class, her name was Yana, she always would bring some paper, so-called spravka, from a doctor, so she had a health condition that she couldn't work. And I don't know, maybe she had for real some health conditions, but she was participating in physical education, running and jumping, doing everything else. But every time it came to go and work, do the manual labor in the fields, she would produce a medical document that her health conditions don't allow her to work in the fields. And she was a Jewish girl. So of course, the other kids were kind of whispering about it, snickering. But one time, one of the guys, as Americans say, lost his shit. And, we were in class and the teacher was reading the list that kids do going to work. And then she mentioned and that Yana is not going because she brought spravka. And this kid yelled, and I quote, «А почему эта старая жидовка никогда с нами не ездит в колхоз?» Why this old жидовка, so that's that rude word, like this old kike woman, never goes with us and work in the fields? So by itself, this statement is just horrible, right? I mean, can you imagine somebody talking about you in such terms? But what made things way worse, that whole class, me included, we just burst laughing. It was just, we found it so funny and it's just so unexpected. So the whole class was just roaring laughing. Of course, teachers, her face dropped and this poor girl started crying and she just ran out of the class. And here's a good spot to pause and have a Jewish joke, because it's kind of relates to this interesting situation that a lot of times Jewish people really shied any manual labor. So here's the joke. So during spring cleaning subotnik, and I don't know if you're familiar with this term, subotnik, that was happened on Saturday, on the day off. Workers had to come back to their place of work and do like spring cleaning, for example. Usually they won't be working, but they'll be cleaning. And it started way back, this famous story about Comrade Lenin carrying a log. Remember I told you a story about that inflated log? So that's subotnik. So during one of such spring cleaning subotniks, all the workers showed up and, they get in rakes and shovels. So there's one Jewish guy, it was his turn and the guy gives him a shovel and he started looking at the shovel. He's like, by the way, do you guys by any chance have a shovel that has a little engine attached to it? And the guy looks at him like, have you ever seen a shovel with the engine? And this Jewish guy looks at him and answers, have you ever seen a Jew with the shovel? So that's kind of this situation, right? And now back to our story about Jewish girl and her medical document. So what happened next, of course, teacher had to do something. So she went to the school manager, director школы. So they had a parents-teachers conference, what they call it here in America, but it's called родительское собрание, parents gatherings. And back in the Soviet days, we didn't have like a individual meeting. It always was the whole class of parents sitting at the desks. So everyone gathered together and the teacher would tell each parent good and bad things about their son or daughter. So that was kind of that type of gathering, родительское собрание, to talk about this anti-Semitic situation that occurred and that really rude words were said, and then the whole class laughed at it. So teacher organized that meeting with parents. And in my family, usually my mother would attend родительские собрания, these parents' gatherings, but this time, I don't know why, but she sent my dad. And my father was and still quite anti-Semitic person. He's just, blue-collar worker. I mean, it's kind of what they call in America redneck. So he went. So, of course, I felt kind of a little concerned because, I'm not sure I would get in trouble with my parents because I left too. But when my father came back from that meeting, he said, all I could say, I had exactly the same question. Why that old kike woman never goes with you guys and work in the fields? So he just repeated the word for word what that kid said, and he was totally agree with that. And now, while we're still on the topic of work in the fields, being children, I had quite similar situation later on when I got into college in the Kyiv Polytechnical Institute, Киевский политехнический институт. Everyone who got accepted, they sent to work for 2 weeks to the collective farm to pick beets, sugar beets, I think they were those. So starting September 1st for 2 weeks, all the new students were required to go and work at the collective farm. Once again, this is a really strange situation where we just had such a horrible shortage of seasonal workers and of combines that could do that job for people. And the reason why I said I had a similar situation, I also had медицинская справка, medical document, because I believe maybe September 10th, I had my eye surgery scheduled. So I couldn't work all 2 weeks. So when we got together, and of course our organizer or teacher was talking about, hey, you guys need to show up, on such time to be picked up by buses, and you will spend 2 weeks working in the fields. I said, by the way, I have this document, медицинская справка, I have an eye surgery on September 10. And he looked at it and he said, okay, it's fine, you don't need to go. So unexpectedly, I had this opportunity, just instead of slaving away in the fields, I could just stay home and chill, right, hang out. But what do you think I did? And what was my logic? I said, oh, no, I will go. I want to go. I just need to leave after first week because of my surgery, but I still want to go and work the first week. And my logic was, all those guys, we don't know each other, and they go there and work together for 2 weeks, so they'll become friends. They'll be just like a group, and then I will show up later, not knowing anyone, being out of this team, and it will be really awkward. I would hate to have that situation when I need to work myself into the group of people that already kind of have bonds. So you see the completely different logic. I saw, there's opportunity to not to work, but at the same time there's a price to pay, and this price to benefit of not working wasn't worth it for me. I would rather work with the guys and get know them instead of, kicking back and chilling, but then I'll have to go through all this struggle to introduce myself, and maybe some people have similar attitude, like, hey, maybe he's Jewish kid, he managed to skip manual labor. So that's kind of interesting. I'm positive that the Jewish girl in our class, she knew that by constantly dodging working in the fields with the rest of the class, that she will get some kind of, let's say, cold shoulder, some whispers behind her back, but they didn't care. She didn't care. For me, it was so important to be part of the team, so I was totally cool to go and work. Maybe one day I'll tell you the story about that experience. It was also quite interesting. So it just, this willingness to go against the grain, against the crowd, just because, I don't know why, they just didn't want to work, or maybe for religious reasons they couldn't work, but That's the difference I see between like my attitude and that girl attitude towards physical labor and towards of benefits to be with the class or stay away from the class. Another interesting detail, most Soviet kids, me included, grew up as a so-called latchkey kids. I believe that's the correct expression, since both parents were working, would come from school having a key on your neck, and you unlock your apartment, eat lunch, and then you play outside or you do your homework. So this was my lifestyle during the school uh, period from September till May. You go to school in the morning, then you come back and you play with your friends outside, having a key on your neck. But most Jewish children didn't play with us outside. And the main reason is that the Jewish parents kept their children busy after school with extracurricular activities, I think is the word. So they'll be going to some music school or additional math school or physics school or chess club, learning piano, learning violin, or maybe staying home with grandma. So they didn't really play with us outside, but they were getting ready for the adult life by improving themselves after regular classes in school. There was only one time that was kind of interesting story, that I realized the kid was Jewish, although he didn't act Jewish. I mean, being busy with violin classes or something like that. So his name was Alexei. Everyone was calling him Lyosha. And he didn't look really Jewish except like he's had really like almost afro-looking curly hair. But he was outside with us playing every day, running around, doing goofy stuff. He was really good in soccer. And I said, I never would think he is Jewish because he was just like everyone else, like normal kids. You see how horrible I am? But then one time he invited us to his place, and I met his parents, and I instantly recognized that they're Jewish, and I was like, oh my goodness, it never clicked to me because he was normal. But his parents were very nice, but they definitely looked Jewish. And then later I learned his last name was like Spiegelman or something like that, so he was Jewish. So that was the only time I remember I was quite shocked because I never before played with any kids, Jewish kids, and they were acting just like other kids. And later, of course, they immigrated to Israel, but Lyosha guy, that's the only Jewish kid that I never suspected he was Jewish until I met his parents. Well, I think it's a good time to pause here and have another joke about Jewish children. So a Jewish kid comes home from school, so that's in Soviet Union, and he got so, what would be the word, affected by the propaganda that he announced to his parents and his grandmother that he decided he won't be Jewish anymore, he will be Russian. And his father says, well, since you're a Russian kid, you'll have to walk to school. Your dad won't give you a ride in his car. And mom replies, well, since you're a Russian kid now, I won't get you nice clothes from our relatives in Israel. I'll get you some ugly stuff at the store that other kids wear. And his grandma adds on, well, grandma will stop cooking chicken for you every day and you're just gonna eat cold leftovers. So kid looked at them and is like, oh my goodness, I'm Russian for only 2 hours and I already hate you Jews. Pretty rough joke, but that's another popular one we had. So as you may guess, jokes about Jews were quite popular in the Soviet Union, and generally telling jokes, we call them anecdote. Anecdotes was quite a normal way of killing time. Here in America, they call it bullshitting. Then people just sit and chat about random stuff. And we were just telling anecdotes for hours. And this ingrained Soviet habit of telling the anecdotes almost got me in trouble once. Actually, not really in trouble, but it could be quite an awkward situation. It happened during my third visit to America, so that's 1997. And I worked again in Michigan with inner city kids from Chicago as a lifeguard. And I was curious if I could locate my former teacher of English. She was Jewish and she immigrated to the United States, and I knew that she settled down in Chicago. And we're talking 1997, so there's no Google, right? There's no way to search online. But since the company that owned the camp was from Chicago. They actually had a Chicago phone book at the office, and huge. So I knew her last name, and I found, I think it was 5 similar last names in Chicago. So I just dialed the very first number. It was the wrong person, but the lady knew who I'm looking for, because I asked for, Rima Arkadievna, and she gave me the correct number. So I called, and that was my former teacher, and she was actually very happy to hear that I made to America, and she invited to come to Chicago and visit them with her husband, which I did after camp was over. I spent there a couple of days, had a great time, explored again downtown Chicago, explored the Russian stores. And one evening she invited a couple of her friends. They were also Jewish, and we had a nice dinner and alcohol. Now I need to mention that when we talk jokes about Jewish people, usually the conversation has this interesting accent, and I think it's how the Jewish people from Odessa, from southern Ukraine talk. I can't explain it, just you can recognize instantly that it's a Jewish person talk. Сарочка, что вы думаете? Как? То есть you could tell right away that's kind of part of the joke is to talk in that accent. But what really shocked me is those 2 people that came to visit, that couple, they did in fact talk like that. I thought it was mostly like almost like a fake accent, but that was real. I think so. They were from Odessa, and they were talking just like we were making this fake accent. They had that real Jewish accent. So that was quite shockingly. And of course, one of the best times to share jokes, share anecdotes at the table. After you had a good meal, have some alcohol, now it's time to have a good laugh. So you start just kind of back and forth. Hey, did you hear this anecdote? So that was my turn, and I started telling the joke, and kind of like a couple sentences in, I'm realizing, oh my God, this is a joke about Jews, and everyone here is a Jew except me. So that was a really awkward moment. I basically had to pretend that I forgot the joke, because I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. So, it's the first time ever that I was actually having a meal in a Jewish environment, put it that way. So yeah, that was really awkward. I don't know if they realized what happened, but I had to just play dumb and pretend I completely forgot the joke. And to wrap up the topic of me interacting with the Jewish people, several years later, I was once again in America. And that time, internet kind of became the thing. And AOL, if anyone remembers AOL, so they had those chat rooms, and one was called like Russian room. And a friend of mine that I stayed with recommended like, hey, you can talk to people that live all over the United States, and they Russians, but most of them, of course, were Jewish. Back in the 90s, I would say probably 90% of immigrants from the former Soviet Union or from Soviet Union were Jewish people. And that was interesting, that was kind of easy way to meet the girls. Is just you kind of start talking to people, and then you exchange pictures, and you can go out of the chat room into like private conversation. And that was kind of instant reaction. Some girl from New York or Chicago or San Francisco ask me for my picture, and I'll send my photo, and there'll be like this pause, and then she will answer, you're not Jewish, aren't you? So it's automatically was assumed that if you're Russian in America, if you're in that Russian chat room, that you're Jewish. And of course, when I show a picture, blonde dude, there was instant just this reaction that girls were like, wow, you're not Jewish. So that was kind of interesting. But anyway, so that's a pretty AOL related story, my goodness. Okay, so this concludes part 2 of our Soviet Jewish people stories, and more to come. I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to like, share with your friends. В эфире программа Ushanka Show. My name is Sergey. I'm 98% Soviet Ukrainian and 2% Jewish. As you can see on this picture, I'm proudly displaying my Jewishness. And we're going to continue our topic, talking about Soviet Jewish people and their life in the USSR. So this is going to be part 3. And before we begin, I would like to thank all my viewers. I'm very impressed. Only 4 dislikes for the second video, and I think I have like 6 dislikes for the first video, considering how touchy this topic is and the fact that I'm not really applying any filters. Nor implying sugarcoating. It's very impressive that people like the story. I guess they prefer that way. So here we go. In one of my previous videos, I already mentioned that it's quite easy, in most cases, to determine just by the looks if the person Jewish or not. You know, curly dark hair, large eyes, bigger nose, bigger lips. But check this out. I hope some of you watching my videos on the computer screen or maybe even TV screen. So this is a sketch picture from the Soviet militia book, which we called Militia. So as you may guess already, this is the reference how to recognize nationality of the person based on his or her facial features. Well, here it's all male. So number one guy, top left corner, is Russian. Second to him is Ukrainian. Third, it's a Lenin. I'm just kidding. It's actually a Tatar person. And number four on the top line is a Jewish person. So let's take a closer look. Thick, curly, dark hair, check. Large, smart eyes, check. Bigger nose, check. Bigger lips, check. So as you see, even in the police sketchbook, same description of the Jewish facial features. And I would love to get my hands on that book because I was told there's a lot of good information there. For example, besides pictures like that, there also was reference what kind of crimes that or this nationality tend to commit. So that'll be really interesting. Well, right next to the Jewish person, next to the right is a gypsy person. So that will be interesting to read what they specialized in. And to wrap up the conversation about appearances, I also need to mention something else, which some people may not like. But Jewish boys always looked quite different from Russian or Ukrainian or Belarusian boys. And here I can use help from the beautiful preacher Paula White, because she can explain you that most Russian and Ukrainian guys, including your favorite comrade, we are...
You uncircumcised Philistine! You uncircumcised Philistine!
You uncircumcised Philistine!
Yep, you heard that right. I actually had to look it up. What the hell was she talking about of being uncircumcised Philistine? But that's what was going on in the Soviet Union, and still going on, I believe, that we don't circumcise our boys when they were born. And, well, Jewish did. But since Soviet schools usually didn't have showers, maybe it's only schools that maybe had swimming pool. But 3 schools I went through never had showers, so of course you never see your friends naked, so you don't know. But when people join army, well, join, I mean getting drafted, then of course it's where can be discovered that you're Jewish, even if you don't look Jewish and your last name doesn't sound Jewish. Yes, comrade. So your 5th column in your passport says you're Russian, but your penis tells me you're Jewish. Another interesting detail is that you could kind of recognize Jewish people by their first name. I'm not sure why. I think some of those names were chosen because of they sounded, so the Russian names sounded really similar to historical Bible names. For example, like Mikhail, Misha, sounded like Moisha. They liked names Lev, of course Israel, but that name was kind of old-fashioned. It kind of died out by the 70s and 80s. Abram, similar thing. There was quite a few people I met their father's name. So Otchstvo was Abramovich. Like we had our teacher Ella Abramovna, so you know she was Jewish, but I in person never met anyone first name Abram. So as I said, Mikhail, Misha, Lev, Evgeny, Zhenya, it's a short form. Arkady was very popular for Jewish people. Also Boris, Albert, Mark. So quite a few actually like a foreign sounding first names. Like I never met anyone Russian named Mark. Eduard, Grigory, that's kind of could be Russian too, but a lot of Jewish people like that name, Grisha, Grigori. So that's for the boys' names. Kind of similar situation was with the ladies' first names. Sarah, it's a classic Jewish name, like all the Jewish jokes will be about Abram and Sarah. So Sarah, Sonia, Yana, and then some these foreign sounded first names like Жанна, Ella, Rima, Rita, and Riva. So for example, that teacher that I mentioned that I went to visit in Chicago, her name was Rima Arkadyevna. So Arkady was her father and her name was Rima. And as I mentioned also, our teacher of Russian language was Ella Abramovna. That's can't be any more Jewish than that. So her father was Abram. Let's talk about family, last names. I don't know why, but many Jewish people in Soviet Union had last names that sounded extremely German. That would end with man, like Feldman, Oberman, whatever, or end with Berg, like Greenberg. So there's right away you could tell that person is Jewish if his last name sounded German. It's kind of oxymoron, but that was the situation. Like I had a teacher of physics, I think the last name was Feldman, Iosif Feldman, so definitely Jewish. So we had this joke based on the situation with last names. So when Norwegians and Swedes were arguing, I think it would be Norwegian and Swedes, who was first, who reached the northern pole, the Jewish guy interrupted and said, "What are you talking about? When Amundsen was still on his way to North Pole, icebergs already were coming back." So iceberg, definitely Jewish person, iceberg. Once again, I don't know why, but quite often Jewish people in Soviet Union had Polish sounding last names. For example, Boris Berezovsky. So last name sounded Polish, Berezovsky, and the first name is definitely what preferred by Jewish people, Boris. He was one of the first richest people of Russia, so-called oligarch, and he ended up running away from Putin to England, where later he committed a really strange suicide, Boris Berezovsky. Another example, Mikhail or Misha Khodorkovsky. So once again, last name sound Polish. Another Russian oligarch who got in trouble during the Putin rule and was actually arrested and sent to the prison. Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And another fine example is Igor Kolomoisky. He is the richest guy in Ukraine, also became oligarch. Kolomoisky, another Polish-sounding last name. And if we talk about еврейские фамилии, Jewish last names in the Soviet Union, we have to mention Rabinovich, because if joke is about Jews, there's always Rabinovich. So that's automatically, hey, this is a Jewish joke if you say Rabinovich did this or Rabinovich did that. So here's the fine example of Rabinovich joke. Rabinovich, I heard that you got a job with the Soviet government. Yes, I did. So what do you do? Well, every day I climb on the tallest tower in Kremlin and I watch the horizon to see when the communism gonna appear on the horizon. Well, Rabinovich, that sounds like extremely boring job. It is, but it's a guaranteed lifetime employment. And I just want to mention that for all the Jewish jokes we had, there was a special category that showed that Jewish people were extremely skeptical and sarcastic about everything socialist, communism, all the Soviet things. So they were playing along, playing the game, but they were chuckling and giggling behind the leader's back because they were extremely sarcastic about anything that was going on in the Soviet Union. So that joke is a fine example. And before we're going to wrap up this video, and I have more coming up about the Jewish people in Soviet Union, I want to talk to you about one book called The Millionaire Next Door. I enjoyed this book immensely. It has great information. It's a real eye-opener about who are the real millionaires in America. But the author made one big silly mistake that actually I was laughing quite hard. And it's a Thomas Stanley, PhD. I think he may have passed away already, but he said something so silly that I need to mention that. So he has this table called the top 10 ancestry groups of American millionaires. And number 1 is English, number 2 is German, number 3 Irish, number 4 Scottish, and number 5 is Russian. So although Russians are number 5 for percentage of all American households and relates to millionaires, there's also another way they grade it. It's called concentration ratio. So all millionaire households divided by all households. So, for example, if you have 100,000 Russian households and 50 of them was millionaire, then you can figure out the ratio. So Russians, according to this book, have the highest concentration ratio of 5.82. Second place are Scottish at 5.47, and then Hungarians. So, oh boy, I missed that part. So Hungarians are number 3 at 4.0. And I don't know if anyone caught that before me, because this book is a bestseller for years. I'm not sure when it was published first time, but they sold millions of copies. But it's not Russians in America that's so rich. It's Jewish people that emigrated from the Soviet Union are so rich. That's quite a difference. You can't call Russian Jews Russians. And they missed that part. It should say Jewish people from former Soviet Union, or maybe even from Russia, but it's not Russians. Russians are not famous for being tight with money. They actually, any jokes about Russian is because how they're super generous. They will spend all the money on drinking and partying and friends and whatever, but they're not famous ever for being tight with money and becoming rich because of that. So this situation with this book, Millionaire Next Door, reminded me that AOL Russian chat room when everyone was there Jewish who spoke Russian. So in this book it'd be Russian-speaking Jewish people maybe, but not Russians. And while we're on the topic of the Millionaire Next Door and millionaires in America, number 4, Hungarians. This is a famous Hungarian person, George Soros. He is a Hungarian Jewish person. Just like Russians are Russian Jews, Hungarians are also Hungarian Jews, the one emigrated before or after World War II. So this is interesting how they didn't catch it, or they failed to, didn't want to mention it, but it's richest people in America by the concentration is Jewish people from Russia and Jewish people from Hungary. And before we're going to say goodbye, there's a Russian joke for you guys. How the Russians can make a lot of money. A Russian guy will steal a truckload of vodka. He will drink up all the vodka, return bottles for deposit, and make a lot of money. Well, my friends, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, comment it. My name is Sergey. I'm 2% Jewish, 98% Ukrainian, and 100% Soviet. Меня зовут Сергей, я родился в Советском Союзе. So we continue to grind through the topic of life of the Jewish people in Soviet Union, and today it's video number 4, and we're actually going to talk about witness accounts from the Jewish person who grew up in Moscow, Soviet Russia. But before we start, I would like to make a couple of comments and just kind of try to clear some things up and answer some questions. First one about YouTube demonetization of my videos. I want to explain what's happening with current videos about Jewish people. So it's automatically turns a yellow dollar, which means it's a limited or no ads. And what I mean automatically, I guess YouTube just reads the title, and if it has a word Jewish, it automatically gives you that yellow dollar sign. So your videos can't be monetized, cannot be monetized, or in limited amount, whatever that means. It's not a copyright strike, so a creator can file a complaint or request a review, they call it, and sometimes it takes 4 or 5 hours, sometimes it takes several days. So all my videos so far, both 1, 2, and 3, ended up being okay for monetization, but it took a couple of days, so I missed this initial surge of views. So that still impacts, I'll say, my bottom line. I'm not really focused on making money on YouTube, but this is what's happening. It automatically gets a yellow dollar sign. I file appeal, then 2-3 days later, somebody like real person, not an algorithm, look at the video. I doubt they watch the whole video, but then they decide, okay, it's fine, it could be monetized. So my previous 3 videos now got green dollar signs, so I'm making real killing on that. But as I said, initial surge of views are done. This is unfortunately how my channel works. I got my subscribers will watch my video right away, and then it just drops like 90%, and it's slowly gains views, but not as first initial day or two. Then we had quite a bit of confusion when I commented on the book The Millionaire Next Door. So when I commented that Russian millionaires in America are actually Jewish millionaires that immigrated from USSR, and that's where confusion is. So in Russian language we say nationalность, and correct translation will be not nationality, but more like ethnicity. Because, like America, if you're born in America, you're American. But then, of course, you have your ethnic background that you originally was Scottish or German, whatever. In Soviet Union, we call nationality, it's like your ethnicity. So I'm Ukrainian based on my parents, not because I was born in Ukraine. So if both parents or father or mother were Jewish, the person considers Jewish, not Ukrainian, even if he was born in Ukraine and grew up in Ukraine. For the same token, any Ukrainian person born in Russia will never consider himself Russian. He is still Ukrainian. So that's what the confusion is. So let's see what Wikipedia and Google search says about which people could immigrate to the United States.
November 21, 1989, the Lautenberg Amendment, Public Law 101 to 167, took effect in 1990, which provided refugee status in the United States for nationals from the Soviet Union and later the former Soviet Union, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia or Lithuania who are Jews, evangelical Christians, Ukrainian Catholics are.
If you're curious about the topic of Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union to the United States and Israel, Wikipedia is a great source. Look up Jackson-Vanik Amendment from 1970 and above mentioned Lautenberg Amendment from 1989. There's plenty of information. I don't want to repeat it here. We need to move on. And as I promised earlier in this video, today we're going to study a witness account, a Jewish person that grew up in the Soviet Union, and he grew up not somewhere, Soviet redneck, middle of nowhere, pound town, Kazakhstan. He grew up in Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Portnov was born in 1956, so he kind of like the last wave of the baby boomers, right? I think baby boomers go all the way to 1964, I believe. So he was born in Moscow in Jewish family. Father was a military officer and mother was engineer mechanic. So a standard Soviet intelligentsia family. Now we need to jump further. So he immigrated with his family in 1990 to the United States on a Jewish immigration. He ended up moving to California. He has successful business. He got his own like a computer programming school going on. And he wrote the book called Amerikanskie Gorki, which can be translated like American roller coaster. This book is in Russian only, unfortunately. It's a huge book. I have it. He gave me as a present when him and his wife Svetlana visited Michigan a couple of years ago. And we met, so I got his book, and this is mostly his story about life in the United States, but in the beginning he mentioned a little bit about the life in the Soviet Union. That's what this interesting information came from. His book is available online for free in the PDF file, so if you're curious, I'll post the link below this video in the comment section, so if you know Russian or you can use Google Translate, you can read this book. It's kind of funny. When I remembered that part of his book, when I started working and thinking about this Jewish people in Soviet Union video series, I actually sent him a posted a comment under one of his videos. He has a YouTube channel. It's in Russian language. And I asked him about this part. And guess what? Remember that joke that Jewish people always answer with question to any question? So when I asked him, like, do you have any more additional information about your experience in being a Jewish? And the answer was, why do you need that? I had a good laugh. So he didn't want to talk about it, but there's some information in his book that he provided. We're going to discuss it right now. Okay, so here we go. Life of the Jewish boy in Soviet Moscow in 1960s. As I said, he was born in 1956, so he went to school sometimes around 1963. So he claims he didn't do anything special as a student. He read a lot, and he really liked geography, just like me. And he actually went to city Olympics. We had those Olympiade for students. I believe I went once. I don't remember how I scored. But then by accident, he got into the school Физико-математическая школа. So it's like physics and mathematics school. So like it's on the top of your regular school. You can attend like in the evening additional courses in physics and mathematics. That's pretty hardcore, right? So what happened, his older brother, who was 7 years older, he was crazy about math, which is already kind of sounds right. I wish my kids were crazy about math, or me for that matter. But he liked math a lot, and he went to college, which is Moscow State University, MGU, on mechanic mathematic faculty, so факультет механико-математический. So that's mechanic, engineer, and with math. Pretty hardcore. And he met there quite a few people who originally went to these advanced schools for physics and math, and that helped them to get in this college. And at that time, they had about 3 to 4 quite good quality phys-mat schools in Moscow. Okay, it looks like it's actually, so there were regular schools, and then they had schools with heavy physics and math, so like going advanced, so let's put it that way. We kind of had similar also foreign language schools that they studied English or German way more than regular school. So this is similar, but only with focus on physics and math. So he went there, and he had to pass entry tests, which he successfully did, and said, my life changed completely after I went to that school. And Mikhail says then that he couldn't put away books till like 11 at night, so he had to do a lot of homework every night and couldn't finish before 11 p.m. First couple of months, he thought he was not going to survive, but then he kind of gets used to it, and actually also fell in love with math. And we have this expression, in English we say nerd. In Russian, for some reason, they say botanik, which is you are a fan of botany, like science about trees. I don't know why that term came up, but it's similar to being nerd. You're so focused on math that he actually said he even didn't notice girls. Then after finishing that school, he got admitted to university. Or he went actually to Institut Связи, so that's a college for the communications, like electronic communications. So he was so much into maths for the first 2 years, he couldn't even remember girls' names. They were also in his class, and they all looked the same, like face-wise. He couldn't recognize them. This is an extreme case of nerdiness, right? And, trading math for math, not paying attention to girls. That's very impressive. So he excelled in college. He said he got all 5s, which is A's, except he struggled to do any, it's not welding, like when you put little electrical parts together, you solder, right? So soldering and making technical drawings, he really didn't enjoy it and couldn't do it really well. The rest, he excelled in everything. So he finished extremely well, top grades in college, pretty much perfect student. Okay, so now we get into the interesting part. So he said, будучи школьником, я не понимал разговоры на тему, что евреев во многие вузы СССР не принимают. So being a student of school, so a pupil, right? So it's not college, still school. I didn't understand the conversations that in many colleges, Jews are not being accepted in the Soviet Union. And he said generally, the way our family lived, being Jewish kind of was more abstraction than like not related to real life. So they didn't practice religion, like not working on Sabbath and stuff like that. It was really hard in the Soviet Union to be Jewish if you try not to work on Saturday, especially schools. We had to go to school on Saturday. So, here you go. There's the Jewish person talks about that he heard conversations in the family that in many colleges you can't get accepted if you're Jewish, but he kind of didn't click with him. So he said, I faced this national question personally, and that was a horrible experience. So my experience going into the Moscow Инженерно-физический Institute, so there was Engineer Physical Institute. So he went to different college eventually. But he said his experience was настолько омерзительным и сокрушающим. It was like so nasty and crushing. So this is a Jewish person talking about going, and he's a top student in school, right? So you think if you have top grades, any college would be like, dude, come to our place. But for him, experience was омерзительный и сокрушающий. So it was like horrible and crushing. So after that, he said, I was in complete depression for 3 days, was laying on the couch, wasn't able to do anything. So now try to imagine what did he experience in that college that it was crushing and so horrible that he got into depression. So this kid had a positive view of the Soviet Union, everything's great, top student, and he goes trying to get in this college to be physical engineer, physics engineer. And I think it's not just they told him, sorry, you can't be here, we don't have any more space. Probably was some rude language used, say, hey, Jew, Жидов не принимаем, or something like that. So there's a witness account about being a Jew in the Soviet Union. Then he continues, I wasn't able to do anything until my brother got me off the couch and took me to Московский электротехнический институт связи. So that's Moscow Electrotechnical Institute of Communications. And he took him there because туда берут, because Jews were accepted to that college. And as it turned out to be, the list of colleges where Jews were accepted was quite limited. So once again, even in Moscow, the cosmopolitan capital of the Soviet Union, where the smartest and brightest were gathering, even there, they had a list of colleges that would just not accept Jewish people. In Ukraine, it was even worse. I read quite a bit about it, and I heard it. Of course, I wasn't Jewish, so it didn't matter to me. But Mikhail, the hero of the story, he met his wife in Moscow, but she came from Ukraine because being a Jewish, she knew she had no chance to be accepted in college in Ukraine, so she went to Moscow, and that's how they met. So anti-Semitism actually helped him to meet the love of his life because she had to move to Moscow. So Moscow was bad, but like, for example, Ukraine was even worse about not letting Jewish people to get into colleges. So, the first crack for him about not liking Soviet Union was experience of trying to be accepted to college. The second was распределение. This is so-called distribution. So after you done with your education, you being sent pretty much where you needed to be. Like teachers could be sent to Siberia and so on. So he had a good education, right? Top student, as I said, finished everything with A's. And said, I started having trouble despite my good grades, excellent grades. No one would take me to work. In the beginning, they would shake my hand, everything's great. But then when they read in my anketa, so in his paperwork, that after his name, Mikhail Portnov, there was the fifth line, fifth column, right? Remember we talked about пятая графа? It's about your ethnicity, nationality. As long as they see that you're Jewish, suddenly like, oh, we don't have any openings. So try to get a college first, but good luck getting a job after that. So now he describes the events of 1978. And he mentions, we actually had a joke back then that I will trade my fifth column for 2 criminal records. So it's rather to be in jail twice. It's easier to get a job being twice imprisoned than being once Jewish. So that's his joke. Объявление, announcement, or like, меняю пятый пункт на 2 судимости. I will trade my fifth column for 2 criminal records. And it says this is what pushed me to start thinking about immigration. And he finally managed to get a job in ЦКБ, Центральное конструкторское бюро Министерства связи СССР. So it's a central design bureau for the Ministry of Communication of the Soviet Union. So he was designing digital devices for transferring data. And it's kind of, again, interesting detail. Out of 25 co-workers in his department, 22 were, he says, чистокровные евреи. So it's a full-blooded Jews. Out of 25, 22 were 100% Jewish, 2 were half Jewish. So pretty much everyone but that person was Jewish. And they were looking for jobs, and finally there's one place that accepts Jews. So in the end, you had this heavy concentration of the Jewish people, and said, yeah, we enjoyed working, it was fun, but there was no chance we could move up or move to some other department because of, like, once again, they had the wrong word in your fifth line. If you in your fifth graph on the passport it says Jewish, not Russian. So that could be quite depressing too. So no wonder having such experience of life in the Soviet Union as Jewish, just because you have a Jewish in your fifth column in your passport, you have trouble getting into colleges, despite the fact you're very smart, you totally qualify for that. After finishing college with top grades, you still have trouble finding a job, once again because of your fifth column in your password. So of course, those people felt, I won't say persecuted, but really not comfortable of living in such society. So he says when there was a possibility to immigrate, Brezhnev was trying to push his peace in the world, and they made an agreement that if you let some Jewish people to, in a sense, there was not immigration, it was actually officially called just like families get back together. So if you have some relative, Jewish, of course, relative in America, then you can get your family together. And they had a quote, 36,000 people a year could immigrate. And it says, I'm not sure why it's only Jewish qualified for that. It says because, could be some Korean people or Crimean Tatars. But he said, I have a suspicion that Congress, United States, has a Jewish lobby, but doesn't have a Tatar lobby or a Korean lobby. So kind of interesting reference that he is positive there's a Jewish lobby in American Congress because that law specifically applied to Jewish people and help him to immigrate, but not any other nationalities in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the Soviet part of this book is quite brief, but he still has quite a few interesting things, details about housing situation in Moscow for his family, which I may make a separate videos, but I just wanted to give you a little flavor, a little witness account about being a Jewish person in the capital of the Soviet Union and how people were treated just because their line of nationality says Jewish, not Russian or Ukrainian. Well, my friends, it's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video, maybe learned something new. As always, please don't forget to like this video and share with your friends. This Jewish people in Soviet Union series actually didn't go really well for my subscription count. It's actually started dropping, but we need to cover this topic, so here we go. We'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.